Thank you all so much. I think we're all very excited to be here. I hope everyone's still focused, even though this is the second session after lunch. I'm just going to go right ahead. Our panel today includes Tubis. She is the Senior Vice President of Data and Analytics at Fusion Media Group and Universal. You know, Ellie, through data analytics, is able to give her organization the key tools they need to understand what the audience is interested in. We have Alex Siegman, who is the AI Technical Program Manager at Dow Jones. He's focusing on bringing AI to all of Dow Jones' core business areas. Ellison, Head of Data Science at Watson Advertising at IBM. Neo is a data scientist with experience in multiple industries with a focus on problem solving. And last but not least, we have Kelly Bourne here. She's a program officer for the Medicine Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation. Kelly started looking at online misinformation for about 6 years ago, right? And now is in charge of a $10 million research fund to help understand how social media is impacting democracy. So we're just going to go right ahead. As Justin just said, the relationship between platforms and media is one that's becoming more complex. Let's start off by talking a little bit about what can different news organizations do to make sure that they're still relevant. Ali, why don't you take it away?
Thanks, Tal, and thanks for having this conversation. It's really important, and I'm really glad to be here and contribute to it. I think that it's really important to understand how the relationship between media and platforms is getting more and more complex before we talk about what we can do. It's getting complex in a couple of different ways. So what we're seeing in the data is that user behavior by our audience is completely changing because of platforms, and our audience is consuming our content differently. We're also seeing that revenue is declining, and these platforms are taking a cut. And we're also losing some of the data that we used to have, because it used to be about our audience consuming content on our site. And we had all of that information, but now the data is across many different platforms that need to share it with us. And then from an editorial perspective, things have changed a lot, because the writer used to write for the audience to share great journalism. And now the writer is writing for their audience, but also for algorithms to pick up their stories and to distribute them. And so that means that our writers are writing for the Google algorithm that's optimizing for user experience and answering questions quickly. That means that our writers are also writing for the Facebook algorithm that's optimizing for engagement, which is correlated to revenue, and wants the Facebook audience to stay on their site and not off of their platform. And so that makes things really complicated. As far as what we can do, I think that it's really important before we get into these relationships with platforms. And now Fusion Media Group has a relationship with more than 10. So it's really, media companies are diversifying, and I think that's important. But it's also important to, before getting into a relationship with a platform, to make sure that they give us, that we have an agreement with them to give us our own data, and to give us the information that is around our audience, so that we can really understand our loyal audiences and give them the experiences that will, to give them their best experience. Mm-hmm. And so what I mean there is, like, Tal, if you're a fan of Gizmodo, and you read a technology news story on Apple News, and you search for a product review of a technology you're interested in purchasing on Google, and you also come to our site once in a while, you look like 3 different people to us. And it's really hard for us to kind of identify you as our loyal audience and to understand what topics you're really interested in. And what platforms are doing is now driving people to not read content on a brand or a site. They're driving people to read content around a topic. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole other experience that I think news organizations aren't ready for. I do think that it's really important for news organizations to put distributed platforms to the side, and also for the data that they do have about their loyal audience who goes to their homepage, because they do still exist, to understand who they are and why they're still coming to the site, and how we could get more of our audience onto our own sites. So that's something. The other thing that I think is really important is for now more than ever, and just having been at multiple media companies and seeing how traffic from platforms has been growing, I think it's really important for data teams in particular to start working very closely with editorial so that editors really understand how our audiences are different across these different platforms and on our site, and become really integrated in that content creation process. And I think that'll give media companies and news organizations that leverage. Just having that information, because algorithms have that information. That's what they're using to make decisions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I see what you're saying, and some of our main, newsroom meetings start with the person from social media talking about what's trending, and then we start a conversation from there. Alex, yes?
I would also add that today relevancy is directly correlated with how relevant your content can be. I think there's an industry shift, whereas the greatest focus now is on how can you minimize the deluge of information that you're putting out there across all of these platforms, and how can you get users what they need to know in the most concise manner possible. And I think that's how news orgs stay relevant amidst everything that you were just speaking to.
Yeah, sure. So I'm coming at this from a slightly different angle. So at Watson Advertising, we primarily our properties are weather.com and the weather native apps. So we have a little different hook that I think other media companies may not, which is weather happens and changes every day, and people are super interested in it. And then we additionally we kind of place ourselves in a very brand safe point of view. So, when your content gets out on a platform into the wild, like, you lose kind of control of it a little bit. So I think how to maintain the relevancy is about what's your angle, what's your strength that keeps people coming back to you, and that's kind of like the way I see it.
Mm-hmm. Kelly?
Yeah, I mean, just reflecting on what folks have said, I struggle with this relevance question because I think at a meta, and what newsrooms can do about it, because I just feel like at a meta level, these huge exogenous forces have changed, right? I mean, you're now at a place where you have a more polarized society, at least in America, than we've had basically since the Civil War. And then you add on to that the sort of human nature, and behavioral science is very consistent in saying that citizens like news. It sort of reaffirms their pre-existing worldviews and tribal identities, and they like it even more if it's triggers some kind of an emotional response, outrage in particular. And then you have platforms coming in on top of this with a business model that is predicated on maximizing engagement and time on site. So it's sort of a perfect storm, and I've really struggled with what newsrooms can do in light of these really challenging external forces. And I think from the vantage point that I sit at, which is really from a nonpartisan perspective, how do you improve the functioning of U.S. democracy? And we've been looking at a lot of sort of research around this. I think it's the question that I keep coming back to is, what can newsrooms do that is both commercially viable and democratically beneficial? And where is that sweet spot, obviously, that I think a lot of us wrestle with, and maximizing for both, and have seen different scholars coming at this from different perspectives, either at the level of the content, what kind of content fits in that sweet spot, or at the level of tools or approaches. And so, like, very quickly, like on the content space, there are a lot of questions about where are the actual gaps, and sort of to your point, Ali, about understanding your audiences, where are the gaps in their understanding that truly need to be filled from a democratic perspective, and can be done if they're true gaps, right, that presumably new information is going to be novel enough to have some kind of commercial viability or retention in audience, especially if you're not going for like climate change or these very polarized issues where new data is not going to change people's viewpoints, but if you're looking at it more at the level of like foreign aid or things like that, right? And Emily Thornton at Syracuse has done some really interesting research looking at where are these democratic gaps, in particular audiences and maybe extremist audiences, those with tendencies. Or like at the tool level, I think people have looked at quizzes versus polls, right? Equally constructive in terms of the time on site. But polls, they don't tell you anything, right? I mean, like, you're asking people to tell you what they think about something that they don't know anything about, whereas quizzes actually have, democratic value, but equally compelling from a commercial perspective. Or I think like David Bornstein at Solutions Journalism has done some very interesting research and work around how do you change newsroom practices to focus not just on the problem, but also on identifying what are potential solutions that have been tried in different geographies, and then has tested that to see, obviously the democratic benefit is there, but also people spend more time engaging with articles that aren't sort of inspiring apathy, but instead give people a sense of here's a social problem, and there are actually ways that you might think about solving it. So I feel like there are a lot of different ways to think about being relevant that scholars are working on.
Thank you. I think I'm going to move on to the next question, and that's kind of the second part of what we're talking about here on this panel. And it's about, everyone's touched on this, collecting data, right? That has become a bit of taboo after the, Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal. Here at Bloomberg, we look at everything through the market, and a couple of days ago, Facebook stock has actually come back to the level it was before the scandal. So you might think, okay, then I guess everyone's forgotten, but not so much. It's still a big issue, and the question is, how should media companies think about kind of organizing their technology, their R&D, their future plans, their strategic activities to kind of overcome this issue? And I'm going to ask you, Neo, to start us off, please.
Absolutely. So I think with the whole, Cambridge Analytica thing for Facebook, there's a lot of fallout for a couple of reasons. So Facebook collects a lot of data, which is not especially surprising to anyone. But what has come to light is, we haven't really been clear on what it is they've been doing with that data. So the more we know, the more questions it raises, which has been a little troubling, but not a big deal. What probably was most troubling with this, debacle really is we found that the policies that they put in place to keep user data safe from unaccountable third parties, they weren't actually doing. They weren't following through with it. And that, once the accountability goes away, once it leaves the what we hope is the safe Facebook walled garden, then who knows what it could do. It could have lots of ramifications. So there's definitely some lessons learned from that. And I think it starts, as a media company or publisher, with transparency and accountability. So, you start there, and basically you want to have, like, as a media company and a publisher, you have a first-party relationship with your users, which allows you to transparently present a value proposition of why they could get, why they should give you some of their data. It can be very transactional. You're providing a better experience. You're, telling them, giving them better products. So it's very transparent. And the second thing is, and this is sometimes a little difficult, a little bit of a paradigm shift for companies. You need to adapt a data-driven culture. And when I say data-driven, it might actually just be data literate. And this has to come from the top down. You need everyone to really understand what is going on with the data, how it's being used, and why we're using it. And by doing that, you give your company the tools to be able to make sure that you're shepherding the user's data in a way that aligns with your values as a company. And so once you set those, that's a good foundation, and then you can begin, building your team that'll start using your data resources effectively and ethically.
Thank you. Yes, Alan?
The one thing I would add to that, and I think you're absolutely right about everything, is that the motto that I think will come to be adopted is, how do you promote personalization while prioritizing privacy. And that was much more of a tongue twister than I thought it was going to be when I said it. But I think that we are no longer in the days where we'll say, we can do this because the data is there and we have it, therefore we must build something with it. And focus more on what is exactly the use case, what is it that our readers, our users, our viewers are looking to do, and what is the minimal amount of information we can collect in order to get that job done. And I think you're going to see that adopted more and more over the coming years.
Yeah, I mean, to Neo's point and to your point, I think we need to understand how the algorithms work and understand the inherent biases, because algorithms are trained on biased information. And if we have more transparency around how they work, and we have data literate people to analyze those algorithms and maybe surface some of those biases, then we can fix it and make it better. I think that there are definitely worlds where people want algorithms to give them a better experience in a personalized way and an ethical way, and I do believe that that's possible.
Yeah, I actually really like that you brought that up, because it brings up this point, and as a data scientist, you're like, oh, well, no, there's nothing wrong with the algorithm. It uses science. It takes care of the bias. The science obfuscates it. But I worry that, that hiding behind that science and then demanding all the data, you can't have it both ways. You need to start out. So maybe put it another way. Data is power in a lot of ways in our society. You can do a lot with data, so you have to be very careful with what you're doing with it. And to Hallie's point, you need to make sure, step one, admit it could be a problem. There could be a problem, and then approach it that way, where you want to make sure that you don't want to cause a problem. You want to prioritize the positives, not just
But I think one of the challenges with that, at least from the platform perspective, is that the business models, I really don't think, are aligned with some of these democratic priorities that we might also want to elevate. And so insofar as that's the case, I'm skeptical that the platforms are going to make all of the changes that we would want, or even a third or a quarter of them on their own. And I think, Allie, to your point on transparency, this is something that we've really been wrestling with until you brought up that we're supporting a lot of research in this space. But the problem has been, well, we want to do research, but we don't have the data, right? Because companies have the data. And so and I think it's really the first time in human history that I'm aware of that we've had a situation where the most robust data about our societies is held by private companies. It used to be that the government had it through the census or other means, or academia had it through surveys. And this is the first time that the richest data about what is happening in our societies and in our democracies is held by private corporations. And so this was something that, as we started supporting research, obviously became a problem for us. And some may have seen, we recently launched a partnership with Facebook, Harvard, Stanford, and the Social Science Research Council that's focused on providing privacy-protected data to scholars to better understand how these how Facebook in particular is impacting democracy and elections, not just in the U.S., but around the world. And so we're kind of started this about a month ago and are in the midst of working out all of those details now. But I think to your point around transparency, we don't know what impact these platforms are having on our society until we get that sort of academic access, and balancing that with privacy concerns is really challenging.
I like to take it a step forward when we talk about kind of future technologies, and to follow up on that. So what role does AI or any other future technology, plays in terms of the impact on journalism that you guys are seeing? And Alex, I'll have you start on that.
Sure. So I think that what we'll see is a divergence between distribution methods and machine learning. So right now AI is this umbrella term, but I think that in public view, it falls into either those Boston Dynamics robots or AR, VR. And then you have more statistical-based machine learning methods and algorithms. And I think that they are both going to impact journalism, but not in parallel. I think you're going to see growth from the distribution methods, and you're going to see growth from the machine learning methods. And I think the machine learning methods will ultimately prove more impactful because, as I alluded to before, the problem is there's a deluge of information, and you need to understand what your readers, your users, your viewers are looking to get from that information. And machine learning is a very powerful way to distill that and personalize it and present it. And so I think that neither has distinguished itself yet. It's still sort of this AI path, but there will be a split, I believe. And I think that in the long run, machine learning and those more statistically based methods, rather than the robotics, AR, VR, those presentation methods are going to have the long-term impact for journalism.
And I assume also being able to do it faster, too, right?
Yes.
Which is key to all that. Yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, I really like the point you've made about the kind of split. And I think AI, it kind of speaks to a problem that, that's kind of hitting journalism. And I'm not a journalist, so just bear with me. Which is, investigative journalists have really good instincts. They know how to ask the right questions. And they know how to follow something once it gets started. But, what's the statistic? Like 90% of all the data that we've ever collected has been collected in the last 2 years, and that keeps being true every year. So it's like, it's an absurd amount of data that's coming in. So, and just put my IBM hat on for a second. The language of going on Carrie's point, which is the data that most of the population is captured by large companies, so enterprise. And what's the language of enterprise? It's PDF, really. So how do you can't read 100 million documents as you're trying to follow up to see shady practices by any company. So I think investigative journalists will increasingly rely on this, these AI and ML and all that fun stuff to ask the right questions and figure out where to start digging.
I think that just as the AI ML can be used to surface relevant information for your users, viewers, readers, the same holds true for the journalists in the newsroom. And as a discovery tool, it's really not limited to any one party. It's just a matter of where you're looking and how you're looking as well.
Yeah. And then I guess the other side of that is if you don't know the right questions to ask, do the unknowns, like how dangerous are they? And by definition, we don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I was going to build off of, is I just think it's so impossible to even begin to predict this. I think, some of the points, we're just at a totally different time. Like, you could have imagined this playing out in a certain way in a less polarized society, in a society with more than two political parties, in a context where there wasn't such low trust in institutions all across the board. So if trust in media was low, you could fall back on government, or if trust in government was low, you could fall back on something else, and it's academia, but it's a tricky one, how this will play out, given all of these other democratic building blocks are also weak.
I'd like to touch on a subject that I know the previous panel sort of focused on, but I think it's an important one when you think about the relationship between media and platforms and how stories are being promoted, and that's the trustworthiness of news these days. So in this era, what do we have to do? What does the news organization have to do in order to make sure that the trust is still there, it's still instilled within its audience and readers? And Kelly, if you'd like to maybe start us on that.
Yeah, though I have to confess, I was not sure when you asked me this question, because I don't think readers should trust in news right now, right? And I think we would be misspeaking if we were to suggest that they should, until platforms have solved or at least improved the situation, news isn't, I mean, in the broadest definition of how citizens perceive news, right? You've got like bloggers and all kinds of other content creators in there. I would say in looking at different ways to solve this problem of trust in information, or our focus is really on disinformation and trying to improve both the accuracy and the civility of content online. I think looking at the philanthropic and civil society space overall, people have tried to solve it in really three main ways. I would say the vast majority of philanthropy and civil society has looked at sort of upstream, what I framed as upstream interventions, trying to improve the quality of journalism, which I think is really important work, and I don't think will solve this problem, because there is great quality content out there, I would argue, about vaccines, about climate change, about a lot of issues, and it just falls on deaf ears because we have become so polarized as a society, and because people, it's just sort of lost, to your point, in this like deluge of information and noise. So I think really important, but that's not going to solve the problem. And then I would say the other sort of plurality of the nonprofit sector has really focused on audience-facing efforts, what I framed as sort of downstream efforts, fact-checking, news literacy, exposing people to news from counter-attitudinal ideological perspectives. And I, unfortunately, have been really skeptical of that kind of intervention as well. I think looking at fact-checking and news literacy, they're really hard to scale. I mean, it takes 5 minutes to make up mistruth and 8 to 15 hours on average to fact-check it. I hear that AI might solve this problem. I'm skeptical of that also. And I think that behavioral science has been really consistent that when you present someone with new information about a polarized issue like climate change, that is not going to change their minds, right? But though I think it can work on more sort of fringe, less polarized issues. And then you take news literacy, and it has a lot of the same scaling challenges, plus the long time horizon to impact. Plus, I have a hard time imagining that many of us in this room are ever going to become sufficiently news literate to suss out like a well-motivated and well-resourced Russian propagandist. I mean, half of America doesn't vote in a presidential election, right? Or read past the headlines. So I'm concerned that placing the burden on audiences to make sense of this sort of deluge of polarized information. I think we put all our eggs in that basket. This is not going to turn out well for democracy. So I have really thought that focusing on the platforms as the feature that really needs to change its practices if we're going to, and of course there's all kinds of challenges around television news being biased as well, but it's really different, you know? I mean, you have a relationship online, it's a conversation, it's multi-directional, you have different levels of sort of micro-targeting, you have bots artificially amplifying fringe ideas.
You feel as if you choose, right? Who your friends are, or you follow.
And you feel like it's a community conversation that you're having, right? So, you know, when I talk to a lot of people about polarized information, the conversation very quickly goes to television. I think that is a problem. But you're also, it depends on what problem you're trying to solve, right? I mean, if it's television, I go to Fox News because I want to watch that, right? Whereas my mom might go onto Facebook looking for like pictures of my kids, and instead it's hit with like alt-right content, right? And so it's this sort of inadvertent exposure. And so I guess to your question, I think you can't ask citizens to trust the news right now. You shouldn't until this problem is solved. And I think to solve the problem, you really have to focus on the platforms and changing their practices.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
I personally
Me too.
completely
I have a
agree
lot
with
of
you.
questions.
I completely agree with you. And whenever I want to know what's happening in the world, I don't trust any media site solely. I will look at multiple sources and try to form my own opinion or perspective on what I think is right. One thing that I feel that Google has done really well, actually, and I'd love to get your perspective, is Google AMP, when I search for Trump, North Korea, has given me a story just the other day from Fox News, from CNN, from Vox, so lots of different political perspectives on one topic that's happening now, right?
Yep.
Do you feel like that potentially or help solve what you're talking about? Because these are respected media sites.
I think, again, it depends on how you define the problem, and I think there's also a lack of audience segmentation in this space often. So I think for this audience, for you who does that kind of diligence, yeah, I could see that being part of the solution. I think one of the challenges in this sector is that we often talk about solutions as if there's going to be like a silver bullet that works for all audiences.
Right.
I think for most of society, they're not going to do that level of work. Although there's actually a fascinating paper coming out tomorrow on the Data and Society did on Google and this question of searching multiple sites. But the problem is that in different communities, I mean, what you put in, if you put NFL ratings up or NFL ratings down, you get a totally different set of responses that are invariably pro-attitudinal. So
I will say one thing to your point about just me as, and I completely agree, I shouldn't just look
you're
at
a more
just-
sophisticated audience.
I don't know if I would say
we're
that.
concerned about.
But when we look at our data, so search, Google is our top traffic driver. It's huge, and it's grown by 50% because of AMP, period. Nothing else. When I looked at SimilarWeb's data, which shows you some directional information about what's happening across other media companies, I'm seeing the same thing.
Yeah.
So I do think that at least directionally telling us that user behavior is slightly changing. And when you look at our audience in particular and how they engage with our content on AMP, they're consuming our content very differently. And they're, from my understanding, a new audience. Hard to tell, but
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, I think, how this plays out.
yeah, I do think that that is growing, and people are, because the AMP it gives you kind of a visual view of what's happening in addition to just a headline, and people are, I think, more likely to click into the visual view and to swipe very easily to that next perspective. So I think that there's hope.
I think there's still what behavioral science has to say about whether that actually changes people's viewpoints, or there have been some scholars that will say there's a backfire effect, and that not only does it not change people's minds, it's that they see what MSNBC or Fox News or some counter-attitudinal site is saying, and not only does it not change their minds, it makes them even more mad that those other people are so misguided. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I don't know.
That's a good point.
Just to add on, so I think that you hear interpretability and explainability all the time with regards to data and trust. And if you can declare how your algorithm or machine got to where it is, then that is reason for trust. But it's a bit of an oxymoron, because if you can interpret it, then you wouldn't need it in the first place. If you could understand it, you might be able to do it at scale, but that's not really what a lot of places are looking to do. They're looking to take it a few steps further. So I'm curious to see whether interpretability and explainability is truly enough, especially algorithmically, or if something else is going to come about and there's going to be a whole new standard by which companies need to truly understand and communicate what someone is being shown and why, or how something was generated, or how something was summarized, whatever it might be.
Well, I think it comes back to this question of audience, right? And like, I mean, Google is transparent in 190 pages about how they're,
Yeah,
you know,
that's a very good point.
and so I think it depends on who is going to interpret that.
But I think you bring up an important point, because that's, sort of, if I think about what we do at Bloomberg, I mean, it's just more from the editorial side, not the algo side, but you're right. I mean, people want to go beyond the headline. They want to immediately understand what it means. Don't just tell me what's happening. Tell me, why should I care? What's the implications? And I think maybe, I'm also hoping maybe there's more hope in terms of people actually looking for this. And this doesn't matter which side, you're on, but more, you realize that there may be more, and maybe you should be asking some questions.
I know, I'm such a downer. I do have hopeful ideas, just not these yet.
Yeah,
I mean,
good to hear different opinions, right?
it might come down to education, like educating the younger generation to search in a certain way that maybe we're not used to.
I think, like, at least with things like fake news and these kind of echo chambers, one thing that gives me hope, and maybe you'll disagree, is these aren't new. It's just the medium by which they're now being delivered is new, and maybe it's more powerful, and maybe that is a game changer. But I'm hopeful that in time people will adapt to it. But I see I see very awkward,
I
transition.
do think that there are ways that this problem could be addressed. But I think it's not going to be a silver bullet. Like often these conversations are like, and what is the solution? And you're like, well, I think in my view, at least from the platform perspective, is that it's probably 15 or 20 different solutions. And once you start to disaggregate the problem into its component parts and say, okay, well, we have a challenge around bots and artificial amplification, and different anonymity policies would help to address part of that. But in an authoritarian regime, anonymity policies are very helpful in protecting democratic minorities. And so how do you roll that out at a global scale? And then you have a micro-targeting policy, and you could go in and say, okay, well, the platforms already say you can't target based on race and religion, and maybe we should extend that to proxies for ideology. And then you have questions around paid ads versus organic content and the Honest Ads Act, and so you can start to chip away at like 5% of the problem here and there. And I feel like ultimately we could get to like a 60% solution, and then you're just left with the 40% that is, we live in a democracy and we should have different opinions. So I think there is hope. It's just smaller pieces here and there.
So on that positive note, yes, please, questions.
Yeah, what impact would...
1 second, if you want. Yeah.
I've read a little bit about how some technologists feel that in order to change the way information platforms operate, a real disruptive force would be if consumers started to say, hey, data's valuable, pay me money for my data. I mean, you want to study me. Facebook has conducted psychological experiments on their consumers, making them depressed some days and exuberant on other days without telling us that they did it. They've given our data away to Cambridge Analytica without letting us know that they were sloppy in doing it. So what do you think would happen if consumers started to say, all right, the data's valuable, give me money? We know that Fusion doesn't want to hear it and Dow Jones doesn't want to hear it, but I'm curious what the foundation thinks about it. What would the impact? Yeah, I mean, that's why it didn't come up.
Planted here as the bad guy.
What does the foundation that is striving for better democracy think?
I think that there are questions. I think a lot of different solutions are thrown around because they are instruments that we are legally familiar with. So people talk about privacy or antitrust or CDA 230 and intermediary liability, and most of them strike me as sort of blunt instruments that will solve other problems very nicely and might not precisely solve the disinformation problem. But we had a fun sort of thought exercise with a group of platform and sort of civil society people recently on this topic of, well, what would happen if, and there's also like the browser plugins to block data. There's different groups that are working on this. And I think there are two mechanisms we sort of hypothesized through which this would affect democracy and the quality of content out there. And the first would be, obviously, you're not going to be hit with ads that are targeted as precisely. And in political context and swing states, that could make a big difference. And then the second that it would obviously reduce the precision with which the algorithms could target other content to you. So there are these two vectors of influence. But even meeting with the platforms and saying, well, would this make a 2% change or a 20% change in the quality of our information environments? It's like, nobody really knows how much of a difference that would make on this particular problem. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we left frustrated.
There's a question here, please. Thank you.
Hi. So Kelly, everything you said made a lot of sense, but I'm kind of dialing it back here in terms of the integrity of news to begin with. So I'm going to illustrate my point with kind of like the hot button issue of Gaza right now, right? So like you have, let's say, 3 different perspectives. Like let's say one side says that Hamas instigated the violence, another side says that like the protesters have died, versus another side saying that like the peaceful protesters were killed, right? So like in an ideal sense, I'd imagine like AI would be the perfect technology to kind of push forward through some sort of like objective truth, or as objective as possible. But then I go back and forth in terms of like chicken and the egg by like the owners of the machines having some sort of agenda to begin with. So that like kind of messes with my head a little bit. So like how does one supersede that for ultimate integrity?
You have
So,
just
a preliminary. So AI is not magical. And you're exactly right. In order to say, and if I understand your question correctly, you're looking to determine objective coverage.
Yeah.
But what is objectivity? I think what you and I and everybody in this room is going to have a different opinion as to what objectivity is and what's left and what's right. And so you're exactly right. Before you can get to that point, you're going to have to set some human boundaries. You're going to have to set that stage. And by that point already, you've sort of rendered it. You might be able to scale a sort of conformity, but the stage that you've set is set, and that's not going anywhere. You can just scale that out. So AI lends itself very well to a lot of problems, and it could lend itself to a problem like that if there were a global consensus by which everyone had the same understanding as to what truth or fact or objectivity meant.
If we had a Ministry of Truth, we would be in a much.
That's
a
what
couple
should
thoughts.
come out of
Yeah,
that's
that's
what
the
should come out of all
uptake
I'm not
from this
suggesting
panel.
it. I'm saying if.
Well, but I do have a quick thought on that, which is the conversation about differentiating accurate versus inaccurate information. Much of it has taken place at the level of the content itself, or like individual articles and trying to grade them or something like that, or at the level of the producer. So looking at New York Times or Breitbart or InfoWars, and invariably you run into problems there of, well, who is to say who is true or not? And then you can go through the whole thought exercise of what happens if Facebook did do that, and you just end up with what happened with 4chan, where they try and do that, and then you have 8chan pop up for the alt-right, and you have just a whole different problem of an even darker conversation. I think more interesting approaches are not at the level of content, but at the level of tools and actors. And it was actually, Justin, you were in here, so I don't know where you went, but had mentioned that Clint Watts coming to speak soon, who has done a lot of work with the FBI and counterterrorism. And I think the approach there is really interesting because they focus at the level of the tool or the actor and not at the level of content. And I think that's what platforms are starting to look more towards as well. So you can start to identify malicious actors, bot networks, troll farms, different tools that people are using, and manage content at that level for organic voices versus inorganic voices, rather than at the level of like what is true and what isn't true.
Yes, please. The question over there.
Sure. In terms of platforms, most web browser platforms have a privacy mode where if I go to search for an engagement ring, for example, that I don't want my girlfriend to see, I know I'm being advertised otherwise, and I have to take this extra step to get there. First, a two-part question: is that legitimate? Is my data still being shared? And two, could other platforms adapt this model, maybe social media, where the user, the audience, has to take this extra step to bypass security or being targeted, really?
So I guess I'll run with this. I think the privacy settings, like if you go into the privacy mode, also congratulations on the so it's a good step. It blocks cookies, it blocks some stored data, and you can have a relatively fresh environment. But the website's still going to know that someone was going in and doing it, and they're going to know. It narrows down, like it obfuscates a little bit of the triangulation of tracking you that they can do, but that doesn't mean that if you are looking consistently over time, they can't start to figure it out. So it offers a level of protection, and I think that's an interesting question as far as like how you get like your information. If you can have a if you think of the way Google works, it looks at all your search history, and over time it builds a profile of things that you'll definitely like, and maybe that leads you into a rabbit hole, maybe not, I don't know. But if you could have like a fresh, non-personalized Google, and then search for a topic and see what that looks like, that could be interesting. But will you then self-select into that rabbit hole, which is another question.
But I do believe that social media sites could say, or could give you an option to say that my data is private, please don't use it to target me, but they aren't. because this is what their revenue model is based on. And so it goes back to incentives.
Yeah, and I think it then raises a question, well, how does that get done? Platforms aren't going to do it, to your point, Allie. I wouldn't say that Congress is a model of effective, legislating right now. And so, and as I said, I'm so skeptical of citizens doing that, although there are some experiments out there with privacy blockers that have like 50,000 downloads or something like that. But I think even for those organizations that have created these citizen tools for privacy blocking, they're like, maybe we could get to 1 million downloads is sort of their So it would require a really different conversation and awareness, I think. And I think it comes back to your question of how much of the problem would it solve, even if we had that in place.
Okay, I know we're done. We're going to do this really quick. I think it's really important when you have these panels to make sure you guys remember kind of the main thing we talked about. I know it's been a day full of conversation, so I actually gave our panelists a little bit of homework, ask each one of them to kind of give you their key takeaways. So, Neo,
Okay.
go ahead.
I'll keep this super short in the interest of time. So, I'm optimistic about we can create the future we want if we incentivize it correctly, because incentives are really how you form it. So if we build our incentives to be transparency, accountability, and then like literacy of data and what's happening, I think that's a really good foundation to try to get this conversation going. So that's.
Thank you. Allie.
You took the words out of my mouth. What I'll add to that is I do think that, like with platforms in particular, it's important for us to own our data from the media perspective, and also as far as platforms go, going back to transparency, we need more transparency around how algorithms work. Google has given it in their 200-page report, and I think that other platforms that have had a pretty big impact on media companies have not, and it's something that should be necessary.
I forgot that you gave us that homework assignment. So I was looking over my notes, and I think the two things that stand out for me, because I never get to talk with people from industry, I'm always in like the civil society space, is this point around the sort of intersection between personalization and privacy, and how do you strike that balance, and thinking for me about what balance makes sense in a commercial context, and is that the same balance that makes sense in a democratic context? I don't know. And then this point about differentiating AI into different buckets, because I'm always like, well, what exactly do you mean when you say AI? So that categorization was very helpful for me to think about like presentation versus machine learning. And
I would say the biggest takeaway is taking a step back and stop creating solutions and looking for problems. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. And getting back to the core, which is understanding what people want and what are they going to pay for? What do they need? What can we give them? And then how can we do it? Is AI/ML the right solution for that? Not just because we can. They must want it. So I think we get ourselves on these loops and we sort of run away without any check.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. It's been that conversation.
Thanks, everyone.